Thanks, Heather, for that reading. It's only a very short one. Short 6 verses are recorded in John's Gospel, but it's also recorded in Matthew and Mark's Gospel in a little bit more detail, but the gist is the same. And if we read it, we see that there's not just one miracle, that's Jesus walking on the water, but 2. And the second one is that as Jesus enters the boat, they arrive at their destination. Jesus, after feeding the 5,000, is being seen as a new prophet like Moses. But John wants us to understand that Jesus is far more than that. And that's confirmed by what follows in this reading that Heather read for us. And here we get great echoes of the Old Testament, and we see in the imagery, the language and the action of Jesus walking on the water to rescue his disciples. We see those echoes of God working for his people through the Old Testament. And here we get another glimpse in Jesus of God's divine glory and God's grace. Once again, Jesus is revealed as master over the natural realm. Some scholars have tried to explain away these miracles. It seems to be a popular thing that Christians want to do these days. And some suggest that Jesus was walking along the lake side. When it says he walked on the water, he's walking along the water's edge, and his disciples are actually travelling close to the coast to the next destination. So it'd be quite easy, wouldn't it, for Jesus to wade out from the shoreline into a boat that was close to the shore and climb aboard the boat. But that solution means that you have to ignore some of the facts in the story. Firstly, it has to ignore that the disciples were heading across the lake. And then it raises questions as to why the disciples would be afraid when they see Jesus walking on the water. And it would also have to ignore the puzzlement of the crowd of Jesus appearing in the place that he was. At the beginning of this episode, in verse 16, we don't exactly know why the disciples got into the boat. It could be that they just didn't know what to do next. So they simply went back to what they knew. I don't know, sometimes that happens with me, you know, when you're stuck for making a difficult decision. You often try and ignore it and busy yourself and occupy yourself doing something else. We call it burying our head in the sand, don't we? And maybe that's what the disciples were doing. We don't know what to do. Jesus has gone up a mountain, got all these crowds here. Let's just get in a boat and do what we normally do. Maybe go and do a bit of fishing. And remember, the same thing happened after Jesus was raised to life again. The disciples were stuck in a room not knowing what to do. So they decide to go back to Galilee and do some fishing. And remember, Jesus meets them on the shoreline there and makes them breakfast. Maybe they were doing what they were told. Both Matthew and Mark's account of this seems to suggest that Jesus had told them to get into the boat and go over to the other side of the lake. And it's possible that Jesus wanted to separate them from the crowd as he was separating himself from the crowd. He may have been concerned that the disciples may have got carried away and swept along with what the crowd wanted to do, and that was to make Jesus king. And maybe Jesus was protecting them because he wanted them to understand more about who he was before they made any decisions. But whatever the reason was, they were in a boat miles out into the lake. This moment is important because through it Jesus reveals more about himself. He reveals more about his purpose to the disciples, and he starts to show us his true identity as the Son of God. Then in verse 17, John places the different people, the different characters in the scene. The disciples got into the boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was dark, usually is at night, and Jesus was still up the mountain praying where they'd left him. The crowd were somewhere on the lakeside. Then, verse 18 and 19, things start to get a bit dramatic. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing, we're told. Matthew and Mark describe it as a storm, so bad that the disciples were afraid for their safety. But then Jesus comes to them walking on the water. I want to just stop there for a second. Jesus isn't walking on any mill pond here. He's walking through the same storm that is causing the disciples to struggle and fear. But just as when Jesus calmed the storm, the disciples experienced more fear when they recognized a bit more about who Jesus was and the power that he had. They were afraid when they saw what Jesus was able to do, and that he could walk through anything that nature could throw at him. You know, in this life, nature will throw us storm after storm after storm. We're in the middle of one now, aren't we? We're in the middle of a physical storm because it's making people ill and taking people's lives. We're in the middle of a mental storm caused by loneliness and not being able to be together. And we're caught in the middle of a spiritual storm because we've not been able to worship together the way we would like. But you may have experienced storms in your life already. You may be in the middle of one right now. But what I want you to know is that you need to have a greater awe of who Jesus is, because this story shows us that he's ready to come to be with you in the middle of the storm that you're facing. And he'll bring you safe home as you put your trust in him. Verse 20 tells us that Jesus tells his friends not to be afraid. I guess easier said than done when you're in the middle of the storm and when you're not God. But Jesus' first concern is for his friends. He wants to comfort them and offer them comfort in their stress. Do you notice that their distress and difficulty wasn't a result of them doing anything wrong? They hadn't disobeyed Jesus. In fact, if we go with the Mark and Matthew versions of this story, they were actually obeying what Jesus wanted them to do. They were going across the lake to the other side. They'd done exactly what Jesus had told them, and yet they still suffered. That's life, as they say. But we don't have to do something wrong for us to experience suffering. And sometimes, even when we do everything right, it doesn't mean that we're exempt from it. How many times have we known people saying, well, they're really good, healthy living people. They do loads of exercise, they eat all the right food, and suddenly we hear that they've got cancer, and within a matter of no time, their life is taken from them, and they're doing all the right things. And we need to understand as well that even when we're following God's instruction, when we're being obedient to him, it doesn't mean we're exempt from the storms and struggles of life. Life isn't going to be easy, even when we're being obedient and walking with God. And the truth of this episode is that in our trials, God reveals himself to us in a way that we could never have imagined. I want us just to stop for 1 second. Maybe close your eyes and imagine that you're on that boat in that storm. You've been rowing hard for hours just to get somewhere, but you're being blown further and further away from the place you want to be. You're not even sure maybe why you're in the boat in the first place. But it's cold and it's wet and it's windy and you're being battered by the storm. And you feel like there's nothing you can do. You can't control the boat. And even though you're frantically bailing the water out, the waves break over the side and fill the boat once more. All you can do is keep rowing and keep bailing and maybe hope for the best. Then in the middle of that, imagine you see your best friend walking on the water through the storm, coming towards you saying, "It's me, don't be frightened." Verse 21 tells us that when Jesus got into the boat, the disciples were glad. Got to ask yourself the question, why were they glad? It doesn't tell us when Jesus got in the boat, the storm ended. Jesus, on this occasion, doesn't calm the wind and the waves. He doesn't order nature to be still. And it seems that their gladness came from simply having Jesus with them, knowing that he was there in the middle of the storm when no one else could possibly be. And in that moment of inviting Jesus into the boat, we're told that they find their way home, that they're in the place they need to be. In this story, that was geographically true, but I guess it was also true spiritually and emotionally. The disciples weren't expecting Jesus to show up. They thought he was up at the top of a mountain, unaware of their plight. And they certainly didn't expect him to turn up the way he did. But that's often the way Jesus acts in our lives. He pushes his way through into the most stormiest, the most frightening, the most lost moments of our lives. And he comes alongside us and says, "It's me. It's all right. Don't be afraid." To experience that has got to bring us hope, even as we experience the storm. You know what? So many people know Jesus is there just outside their boat, but they won't let him get in. But he wants to be invited in, to be able to offer peace for our fears, hope for our despair, and a destination when we feel totally lost. Here, Jesus demonstrates his care and his power. He loves us and he cares for us in the midst of our storms. And he comes to us and he reassures us, "It's me, don't be frightened." Are you ready to let him in? Amen. just before Joyce leads us in some prayers of intercession, we're going to sing When Trials Come, No Longer Fear. And after those prayers of intercession, we'll sing My Hope is Built on Nothing Less. So we sing together When Trials Come.